Welcome back, beautiful children, to the next chapter of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. Yesterday, we read about the Boniface estate, where the rats had found a fabulous home to winter in while they were trying to figure out what they would do next. Remember, this house was big, luxurious, had lots of food in it because the people that lived there had gone on a honeymoon for a year. And in this house, there was a huge library, and the rats read all the books they possibly could before they moved on. I'm wondering what will happen today. Our chapter is The Main Hall. There came a knock on Nicodemus's office door. It opened, and Justin and Mr. Ages entered. "Back so soon?" said Nicodemus. "Soon?" said Justin. "It's past noon. It's lunch time." "Past noon?" Mrs. Frisby stood up, remembering her children waiting at home. Down in the rat's home, in the artificial light, it was hard to tell the passage of time, and she'd been so engrossed in Nicodemus's story that she had not glanced at the clock. Justin was wearing a satchel, like Nicodemus's, and from it he took a small paper package. "Here, dragon's medicine," he said, putting it on the table. He asked Mrs. Frisby, "Did he tell you about the toy tinkerer?" Nicodemus said, "No, I was just coming to that." "But I can't stay to hear it now," said Mrs. Frisby. "My children will be waiting for their lunch." A plan was worked out. Mrs. Frisby would go home and take care of her children. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and the other rats involved would work out the details of moving her house, which would be done that night at about 11 o'clock, after the Fitzgibbons are asleep, and we're sure Dragon is too, said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby would return in mid-afternoon to the rose bush. Mr. Aegis said, "And I'm going to lie down. After making that trip with this cast, I'm tired." "You can have your choice of rooms," said Nicodemus. "Now that Jenner and his friends are gone, we have 7 empty rooms." "Thank you," said Mr. Aegis. "Mrs. Frisby, when you return I will tell you as well as I can exactly how to put the powder in Dragon's food." As she hurried home, Mrs. Frisby considered just how much she would tell the children about all that had happened, and all that was going to happen. She decided at that stage, at least, she would not tell them about their father's connection with the rats. Also, that she would not say she'd volunteered to put the sleeping powder in Dragon's bowl. Why, that would worry them very much. And she could not tell them, perhaps, when it was safely done, when among the other things there would be no chance for Martin to volunteer to take her place. She would tell them simply that as the owl had suggested, she had gone to the rats and asked for help, and she had found them friendly and intelligent, and a group of them were coming that night to move the house to a place where it would be safe from the plow. That would be enough. She could tell them the whole story later, when she knew it all herself. But it was not enough. The children were skeptical at first, then intensely curious, especially Timothy, who was looking stronger and feeling more energetic, but still laying in bed, primarily because Teresa and Martin made him. "But why should the rats do that?" said Timothy. "We don't know them at all. Why, nobody does. You know they keep to themselves." "Well, maybe it's because the owl sent me to them," said Mrs. Frisby, searching for an answer that would satisfy him. "Well, they seem to be impressed by the owl." "Oh, for that matter," said Timothy, "I don't even see why the owl wanted to help. Why, he's no friend of ours either." "Maybe they thought some day we could do them a favor in return." "Oh, Mother," said Cynthia, "how could we ever do them a favor?" "You forget. I did do Jeremy a favor, and that's what started this whole thing." "That and my getting sick," said Timothy. "Oh, I wish I could get up. I'm tired of being in bed." "Not yet," said Mrs. Frisby, glad to change the subject. "You must save your strength, because tonight you will have to get up for a little while when they move the house. Now, we must be sure that you're all well wrapped up, and hope that the night is warm." It will be," said Martin. "It's turned quite hot outside." They all sat down and ate their lunch. Now that afternoon Mrs. Frisby told the children that she must leave them to confer again with the rats about moving the house. When she thought of the danger that she faced in just a few more hours, she wanted to kiss each of them good-bye. But knowing that Timothy, at least, was already suspicious, she did not dare do that, but told them only that they should not worry if she was a little late getting home for supper. Now, on her way back to the rosebush, she felt quite relieved, almost cheerful. Her problem was nearly solved, and the final solution was right in sight. If all went well, Timothy would be saved. If all went well, then the thought of what she had to do came back to her like the clanging of an alarm bell. What worried her most was not so much putting the powder into Dragon's bowl, but the fear that at that last minute she might lose her nerve and bungle it somehow. Why, that could wreck the whole plan. She looked forward to the Fitzgibbons' farmhouse, and there on the back porch, lying in the sun, was Dragon. He was watching a pair of sparrows playing in the grass halfway to the chicken yard, and the tip of his tail barely twitched as he deliberated whether or not they were near enough for him to spring on. He looked very big and very dangerous. At least he was not looking in her direction, and Mrs. Frisby hurried on to the bush, directly to the hidden entrance, and she slipped right inside. And when she reached the arched portal, Brutus was standing guard just as he was before, but this time he greeted her politely. "I've been expecting you," he said. "May I go in? If you'll wait just a minute, I'll get Justin." He went inside the arch and pressed a small button on the wall. Mrs. Frisby had not noticed it before. "A doorbell," she said. "It rings a buzzer down below. If I push it 3 times, you'd see some action." "Action?" "That's the alarm signal. A dozen rats would come out of the door ready to fight. All the rest, with the women and children, would be hurrying out the back door." "Well, I didn't know you had a back door." "Well, it comes out in the woods, in the blackberry bramble. It's got a longer tunnel than this one." When Justin appeared, they went down the same hallway as before, but this time, when they reached the chamber where the elevator and the stairway led down, Justin paused. Nicodemus thought you might like to see our main hall. Just a quick look," he said. "He said you asked about our plan." "I did," said Mrs. Frisby, "but he didn't tell me about it." "Well, it's more than just a plan now, but we're used to calling it that. If you see the main hall, you'll get an idea of what we're up to." So instead of going down as they had before, Justin led the way across the chamber where, as Mrs. Frisby had noticed, the tunnel continued. They walked along for what seemed several minutes. "Somewhere right along here," Justin remarked, "we're entering the woods. You'll notice the tunnel runs a bit crooked. We had to bend it to go around the roots. Some were so thick as fence posts." They went on until they came to a fork in the tunnel. "Right fork leads out to the blackberry bramble," said Justin. "Left fork leads to the main hall." They took the left fork. "Now brace yourself for a big surprise." From ahead came noises. The sound of many rats talking, a sound of hurrying and thumping, of machinery running. They stepped into a room full of activity, just like a factory. It was the biggest room that Mrs. Frisby had ever seen. Why, it was the half the size of a house, with a ceiling and a floor of hard gray rock. It was brightly lit with electric bulbs, here the large ones, strung unshaded, and beneath them the rats at work everywhere. Rats running electric motors that ran belts, that ran small circular saws, lathes, drills, grindstones, and other tools. Mrs. Frisby could not name all of the tools. There were rats hammering, welding, cutting, but most of the rats were hauling things. There was a steady procession and to and from the far end of the chamber, and each of these rats wore a harness to which was fastened a pair of large, sturdy sacks on each side, like a miniature pack-horse. As the rats trooped in, the sacks were empty. They disappeared into part of the room that was hidden by a high wall of wood, and when they came out, the sacks were full and heavy. And as she watched, a troop of 10 Their sacks bulging went past her out into the tunnel. They greeted Justin and nodded at her, but they did not pause. She noticed that just inside the entrance an electric fan whirled and whirled around quietly, aiming inward, pulling fresh air into the room from somewhere out in the woods. Mrs. Frisby stood beside Justin and she gaped. Why, she felt dizzy at the sight, the motion, the noise, and the size of the room, which must have measured 20 feet long and almost 20 feet wide. Why, however could you dig out such a big room? She asked. Oh, we didn't, said Justin. We found it. It's a natural cave. You can see that the ceiling and the floor are solid rock. Why, that's the reason, or the main one, that we chose this spot to live. Others had lived here before us, probably for centuries before there was a farmhouse. Maybe bears, then wolves, then foxes, then groundhogs. We had quite a cleaning out to do, I can tell you that. When we found it, there was a large hole, only a few feet long, leading straight in, but it was so full of sticks and leaves that you could barely see it. We closed that entrance entirely, and we dug another one, larger and narrower, about about as big as a back door might be. And then we dug our living quarters under the rose bush, and the entrance you came in. But the cave is still the chief workshop. Let's go on in. As they entered in, some of the rats looked up, some waved and smiled, but all quickly turned back to the work that they were doing, as if they were all in a hurry of some sort. Oh my, they're all on a schedule, Justin explained, talking close to Mrs. Frisby's ear to be heard above the noise. So they can't stop working. They've got lots to do. One group, especially busy, was gathered around an odd-shaped object of wood and metal about a foot long. It was curved and had a point at one end. It looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, rather like the side of a small boat. Could the rats be making a boat? And then she saw that they were fastening a strong metal ring to the top of it. Justin led her to it. That, he said, is our most important invention, the key to the whole plan. We made a pilot model last fall. We tried it out, and it worked. So now we're making 3 more. My, what is it? Said Mrs. Frisby. Why, it's a plow. Nicodemus designed it himself after reading every book he could find about farm tools. It's light and sharp, especially made to be pulled by rats. It takes 8 of us to pull it, more if the turf is tough. But with it we can turn over in 1 day of hard work a patch of earth about 10 by 15 feet. But why would you do that? What do you need it for? Come over here. I'll show you. He led the way to the back of the cave where the high wall stood. He opened the door and beckoned her inside. She stood in a large wooden bin, staring at her feet, and rising in a slope to the wall of the cave was a small mountain of grain. Oats, said Justin. He led her on, opened another door on another mountain. Wheat, he said, and others. Why, there's barley and corn, soybeans. We've been building these stockpiles for a long time, he said, all from Mr. Fitzgibbon's barn. We now have a 2-year supply for 108 rats. Plus, we have enough to plant for 2 crops, in case the first one fails. In there, he gestured toward the last bin in the row, we have boxes full of seeds for tomatoes, beets, carrots, melons, and lots more. All the time they stood there, the steady procession of rats continued. They entered the bins, took off their harness sacks, filled the sacks with grain, put them on again, and left through the tunnel out the back door. They looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, like very large ants, endlessly toiling on an anthill. Justin must have got the same impression, for he said, "If the ants can do it," Nicodemus said, "if the bees can do it, then so can we." Oh my. Do what? Oh, why, live without stealing, of course. Why, that's the whole idea. That's our plan. And that, my dear children, is the end of the chapter, the main hall. Very interesting. So now we've learned today that the rats have stored all kinds of things, seeds to grow things, and they have corn and wheat and barley and things to eat. And I think it's interesting. He says his plan is to live without stealing. I am wondering what that means. Can you write me a quick couple of sentences and tell me what you think? What do you think? What does he mean that they're not going to live by stealing anymore? Why, live without stealing, of course. That's the whole idea. That's the plan. I wonder what Justin meant. And then, my dear children, I wanted to go back to a sentence here where they're comparing what the rats are doing to ants. And it says here, they entered the bins, took off their harnesses, talking of the rats, filled their sacks with grain, put them on again, and left through the tunnel, out the back door. They looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, like very large ants, endlessly toiling on an anthill. That's an interesting word, that word toil. So, toiling. Let's think about that. The ants are constantly getting ready and getting food for the winter, right? They're always, whenever you see ants, are grabbing things and trying to take it back to the anthill. And bees are constantly gathering nectar, right? They're making honey. They're constantly working. So, thinking about that, I think this word toiling might mean working. So let's put it in there and see if it makes sense. They looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, very much like large ants endlessly working on an ant hill. To toil means to work. That is an interesting word. All right, my sweet children, have a fabulous day. I cannot wait to hear what you think it means by them living without stealing. Write me and tell me, and I will see you soon. Have a fabulous day.